Yes, it is 3:10. Hello, everyone. My name is Young Chan Lim. I am a coordinator of student development in UCDC here. And I am very excited for you all to join us right now or watch the video in retrospect for Navigating Diversity panel. The point of today is to have our two panelists that I will be introducing very soon to talk about their experiences in navigating the workplace and how they take up space, how they view and process information while holding historically underrepresented salient identities to them. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our panelists. So we have Debbie and Jenna, and in that order, if I can have each of you talk about your job position and your salient identities and a boring fact about yourself.
Jen, do you want to start?
Oh, okay. I can start. Hi, I'm Jenna. My pronouns are she, her, hers, as it says. I work for a Democrat in the Senate as an assistant to the chief of staff. I did UCDC in fall of 2018, where I also interned on the Hill. I graduated from UC San Diego. And my particular salient identities are I identify as a queer woman, especially one that is more androgynously presenting, butch, however you want to describe that, as well as I have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and a panic disorder. So, kind of the discussion of mental health as well. Oh, and a boring fun fact about me. I bought all of the Percy Jackson and the Olympian books last week.
All right, thank you. And Debbie?
Hi, I'm Debbie Deas. I am the Interim Director of Student Services here at UCDC. I've been working in DC for about 4 years now, and been at the University of California for about 9 years. My salient identities are pretty visible. So I would say that my targeted identities are that I am a full-size or overweight, dark-skinned Black woman in this current US of A, which is somewhat challenging most of the time. So that's a perspective that I'll be sharing from today. And I know you told us that you were going to ask about a boring fact. And I guess my boring fact is that I have a dog who has been extremely helpful in this time of separation and physical and social distancing.
Thank you, Debbie and Jenna, both for sharing. And if I can just add, so Debbie's dog is a small Chihuahua named Howard, but he goes by Howie. He prefers it, I think. That's what he told me. And he loves food so much that whenever I see him, he acts like Debbie starves him. And I know she doesn't because I know Debbie well. Like he eats very well. So Howie is a great joy to have. So I am very thankful, and I think everybody here is so thankful that both of you made the time to be here, especially in this current climate with the workloads that you both have. So I do want to start off today by asking you both, what are some challenges in navigating the in the workplace, connecting with others while holding your salient identities to you? What makes it hard? Debbie, would you like to share first?
Yeah. I think the thing that tends to be hardest for me is are the expectations around my identity. And so I think as a woman and as a Black woman, I think that there's this weird line that I think folks sometimes expect me to, there's this weird line that I feel like I am always towing on, right? So I think that as a woman, it can be difficult to be I tend to be a very matter of fact person. And that can be very difficult for some people. And I think that is especially difficult when talking with women, because I think that folks that present as cisgender men tend to be able to be matter of fact and just kind of like say things off the cuff and it's not that big a deal. But as a cisgender presenting woman, I think people sometimes have a hard time with that. Sometimes I feel like I'm expected to be more nurturing, a little bit softer, and that kind of thing. But then if I do that too much, then it's seen as patronizing. And I think add to that, me being a Black woman, especially in some of the circles that I run in, the spaces that I tend to be in for work tend to be a little bit more liberal, tend to have people lots of different identities. And those spaces oftentimes still have those kind of stereotypical expectations, so that I would be maybe be expected to be a little bit more maternal or be like the sassy Black woman, or if I'm having a bad day or I'm really passionate about something, then I'm angry. And it's like, but things are happening that everybody should probably be angry about, so even if I am angry, it should be okay. But it's just, I think that's the thing that's really challenging. Like, it's difficult for me to have a bad day. It's difficult for me to be what I would describe for myself as a strong leader. And so I think I think the hardest part, I guess, is constantly kind of towing that line of, how do I present myself in this space to be received and to be heard? Because I think that a lot of times what I say is often shadowed or filtered through what people's perceptions are about me. And I think that's true for everyone, because everybody has some level of implicit bias. And so I feel like I'm constantly trying to navigate other people's implicit bias, I guess.
Got it. Thank you for sharing. And I can't imagine how it must be to, go to work, which can be hard and difficult in itself, and then also have to have this additional layer of worrying about what other people expect of you. And that's just
Yeah, beyond just general job expectations.
right.
Like, I don't get
Right.
to just do my job.
Right, exactly. Which sometimes is also just not easy to begin with.
Yeah.
Oh man. And Jenna, you said that you're assistant to the chief of staff for a Senate Democrat on the Hill. So how is that, navigating that space with your identities?
So it's a lot. Something that I definitely am in my own space challenging with is trying not to fall into the stereotype of like being a female assistant and kind of like being this person who doesn't have any like actual salient work. Like people will reach out to me, not just in my office, in other offices as well. And I know other female assistant chiefs of staff, and we talk about this. But it's this idea of like people will come and ask us to make photocopies or ask certain questions. And this has happened in other jobs that I've had where I'm assisting somebody and helping them make decisions. And when you are a woman in an assistant position, there's an automatic kind of denotation in it, which is kind of frustrating. And when I accepted the job, actually, my mom told me that I needed to consider whether or not I wanted to take it, though, because she said you don't want to just be another female assistant. And so, especially with my new job, well, it's not new anymore. I've had it for almost a year, but with my position that I'm in now, there's definitely that. But another issue that I think is really important to bring up, especially in liberal spaces, is, and this isn't my only job in a liberal space, and it's happened before, but this kind of unnecessary tokenization where suddenly if something's happening and it relates to my salient identity, if I'm like the only queer person in a room, everyone will like look to me and they're like, Jenna, please speak for the entirety of the LGBTQ community. And sometimes it's on really hard days, like when the Supreme Court was debating whether to allow discrimination against LGBTQ individuals in the workplace. People are coming up to me and they were like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Tell me everything that's going on in your headspace. And I'm like, how do you think I'm feeling? I'm feeling garbage. I'm sitting right across the street from people who think that it should be legal for me to not hold a job. And so that has been something that kind of comes up. And I think, especially in more liberal leaning spaces, people that are in the majority don't think about that like unnecessary tokenizing that they kind of do from time to time.
It's I love what you shared towards the end just now about the tokenization, and I also want to ask Debbie because I wonder if that's what you go through sometimes at your workplace, where people, whenever African American topics or any of your other salient identities issues come up, do people, immediately look to you and ask you to be the representative of your whole community? And if so, how do you begin to navigate that?
It does happen sometimes. It's interesting because sometimes it happens outright, like Jenna was describing, where it's just a flat out ask, and then other times there's the awkward looking but not looking, like try like I think people know that they shouldn't assume that I'm gonna have that experience or have that understanding, but
Right.
it's also very clear that they're waiting for me to share the experience because they do assume that I'm gonna have it. Um, I I honestly don't have a great answer. I think that I love Jenna's response of how do you think I'm feeling, because many times I would say, especially for folks that hold a majority identity, when you're engaging around a targeted identity, many times that check-in is about the majority and not about the targeted. And
Mm,
so, and I experience that myself because I hold a majority identity when it comes to my nationality, my citizenship, my sexual orientation. Like there are plenty of ways in which I hold majority identities, and I have to remind myself, like, am I approaching this interaction out of care and empathy and compassion for the person that I'm talking with, or am I approaching this interaction because I want to be seen as, I want to present as an ally, or I want to be seen as caring? And so I think it's important to really be in tune and in touch with that.
mm,
And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the interaction at all, but I would venture to say that, and Jenna can confirm or deny this, and this might be useful. And I will also say that if Jenna does confirm or deny this, this is just the experience of one person, not all people.
right.
That in that moment, that the Supreme Court decision, it probably would have better served Jenna for somebody to say, "Hey, I'm thinking about you today.
Yeah.
Um, I I assume that this might be a difficult day. I'm not looking for you to engage or talk with me about it, but I just want you to know that I'm standing in solidarity with you."
Yeah.
Um, and then let Jenna decide if you're someone that that she wants
Yeah.
to open up to
No.
and
Right.
talk to about this.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
yeah.
it's very difficult, especially in some of these spaces. And Debbie, I'm sure that you can kind of attest to this if it's not just in the workplace as well. But um, if you have to talk about and kind of like sit through and verbalize your terrible feelings, like that's already so much emotional energy that to like have to like
Mm,
verbalize like, oh yeah, like this is so terrible. I was just checking my emails, but now that you've asked me to relay my thoughts on this, like,
Yes.
yeah, I for me personally, it's more of like not forcing somebody to feel all of the trauma that they're already going through and that negative feelings. Just personally for me, that's how I tend to go about these things with my majority identities,
mm,
because as when I'm interacted by some people in the majority for my minority identities, that's how I want people to engage with me. And so it's just like it's just an interesting subsect of like people have the right intentions, but it's just it
Mhm.
can be so exhausting.
Oh yeah. I think people are incredibly well-meaning. I think there are very few people in the world who are malicious in their intent. Um, and at the same time, I think that um, that we have to be thoughtful about how we do that. And that doesn't mean that we should be in a place of freezing or disengagement where we're not engaging. I think we have to know that we're going to make mistakes, and that it is okay to make a mistake, and it is also okay to be called out on the mistake. And that it doesn't mean that that person is necessarily angry with you or feels like they can't ever talk with you again, but how you respond to them responding to you will probably have an impact on if they feel like you're a person that that can be trusted with these types of conversations. And I love that. I mean, it's so interesting, like you said, Jenna, you know, when these things are happening, it's not that we're not aware of these things. Sometimes we're doing a real good job of building a really good fortress around ourselves to not feel or deal, because there's already attacks on us in those spaces, right? So there's already, the expectations are already different for us in those spaces, whether they're implied or actually stated. Hopefully not too many of them can be stated anymore, but you know, because laws. But there's already so much that is at stake for folks that hold targeted identities in the workplace, that to be reminded of that thing or to be asked to deal with that thing can cause extra pressure and fallout that it's not necessarily intended, right? So if I'm feeling, you know, as a Black woman, that there are expectations of me to be a certain way in a workplace, when you add the element of you talking to me about, you know, like the mass killing of Black people in this country in a time where I'm not prepared for it, and I break down crying, like that's another tax that I then have to deal with, and another thing that I have to clean up. And so I'm not saying that I don't want to engage in those things. I just think that folks have to be thoughtful about how, and also remember that just because you come to this point of enlightenment, that's great. And you need to do the work to learn about those things and have really good conversations about those things. It's wonderful that you are now having some understanding of what it's like to be Black in America. I have been dealing with that for almost 40 years now. So like, it's also okay if I decide that I don't want to engage in that conversation. It doesn't mean that I don't want things to change. It doesn't mean that I don't like you or that I don't want to talk to you about it. It just means that it maybe means that it'd be kind of like talking to Anthony Fauci about a volcano baking soda experiment. Like, he's way past that for his science fairs. And so like, I just, you know, you go do some of that work and then we can talk when I'm ready.
Yeah. And I know Debbie just talked about racial identity. Jenna talked about being queer in the workspace. I think another, popular is not the right word, but very well acknowledged in certain circles, are mental health and ableism. So if those identities apply to you all, how does that identity affect you and how you navigate that workspace right now? Jenna, would you like to share first?
So I grew up in a very anti-mental health household. It has gotten a lot better, but when I was growing up, it was very much a taboo thing. And I came into the professional workforce with internalized ableism on this space in particular by thinking that the most unprofessional thing that you can ever do in your entire life is disclose to your employer that you have a mental illness. And kind of like building in that level of shame and kind of distrust in yourself and your experiences. Unfortunately, and also fortunately for me, I didn't actually get an option on whether or not I wanted to disclose my mental health to my employer, because on my very, very first week, day 3 of my brand new Washington, D.C. job, I got triggered by a constituent and I had a panic attack in the front office in front of chief of staff, 25 constituents, almost all of my regular recurring coworkers, and because I had kind of left everybody in the dark, nobody knew what was going on, and there was probably a 25 to 30 minute post panic attack freak out amongst HR and all of my kind of uh, coworkers trying to figure out, like, how can we support you? And I sat down with the chief, and I kept on apologizing, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get fired, because he's not gonna think that I'm good at this job. He's going to, like, all of these different things tying into that shame of like they shouldn't know. And he basically looked me in the eyes and he was like, well, I hired you because you're competent. Your mental health doesn't change that. And if it's an important part of your life, I should know about that, especially if it's like, if you have a mobility disorder or something like that. If it's going to affect how you work some days, it's not going to look negatively on you. I just need to be aware of what's happening. And I think that was probably one of the most positive experiences that I ever had, and kind of able to come over that internalized um, ableism. And because we work directly, we have a very open relationship about it. But with the rest of my coworkers and with uh, places in the past, there's always this kind of feeling of not being able to disclose what's really going on, especially in the pandemic, and just trying to be open and honest. But I'm pleasantly surprised that my mother was wrong, and that first of all, it's illegal for people to fire you because you have a mental illness, and second of all, most people are really just looking to support you because they've hired you for a reason. And so, yeah, no. I forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, that's my mental health journey in the workplace.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I think hearing about your experience, seeing you so open to talk about what you've gone through, I imagine it's very validating for anyone to hear that and realize that they don't have to be ashamed of it or to feel like they have to hide it in their workplace or their internships. Debbie, did you want to add anything?
I would just say I won't speak in too much detail, but I would say from a place of self-care, make sure that you have a good network of folks around you. I'm a huge advocate of having professional help as well. I think that seeing a therapist should be like getting a physical. I think everybody should be doing it at least once a year. Um, and from, I speak as an employer and a supervisor, I would say that it's extremely helpful when, if for no other reason, to have a therapist is extremely helpful to, if you're able to do it, so that you can protect yourself. Because if it's useful to have these things documented somewhere, and if for any reason you need time away, that therapist is a medical professional and can do things towards, the Medical Leave Act, which, most of us working in the US have, we have access to. So I think it's a nice precaution. So I would say make sure that you figure out the things, have some level of self-awareness, figure out what you need to take care of yourself, and put some things in place so that if you do need more care, you're able to get that.
I love having both Debbie and Jenna here because Jenna is like the affirming, validating storyteller, and then Debbie comes in with like the tips and intertwining that with practical advice, and it's like a 1-2 punch that works really, really well. So I think for our students, I do want to stress that if you are able to get professional help, I personally also support it, recommend it to you. It's very helpful if you can do it. And in terms of navigating that with your internship, your classrooms, we have our academic departments in UCDC, Zebrain Saeed, Jennifer Diascoro, our academic department. Please reach out to them, email them. If you want any help in figuring out how do I even, begin to talk to my internship about my accommodations, my needs, our internship, AIT, and UCDC, our program administrators are here to talk to you. So if at any point you need any help with formulating conversations, just know that we are here to help you out. And I want to switch gears because we've been talking about challenges for Jenna and Debbie. I want to ask you both in terms of being an asset, right? Because I think those of us with historically underrepresented identities that are very important to us, often have majority identity folks and even our own communities talking about us from a lens of deficit, talking about what we don't have, what we can't do, what we don't have access to. If we want to switch the gear into talking about it in an asset-based perspective, for Debbie and Jenna, how have your identities been an asset, been a plus to you in your workplace? Debbie, would you like to share first?
Sure. I would say that on the flip side of that, all targeted groups are not monoliths and we don't represent our entire group. The flip side of that is that we do offer perspective. And I think that's something that is extremely valuable in workplaces. So, especially when systems are being developed and avenues to access are being developed and that sort of thing, I think it's useful to have folks that have different backgrounds who may have different perspective and access to communities that can influence those perspectives, right? So I can have, all the queer friends in the world, but I'm not living life as a queer person in the US. And so it doesn't matter. I mean, not that it doesn't matter, but it's not as useful for me to just, read about and know about some of these things. Like, to have that lived experiences is different, and it can influence how things are set up. So I'll just give a really quick example. So we're working on a basic needs program here at UCDC. And as sensitive as I am to, the challenges of undocumented students and learning about kind of what they're going through, one of the things that we hadn't considered when we first started talking about this, one of the first things that when we started talking about this was, our undocumented students are saying we don't have access to aid. So you getting us access to things like SNAP and CalFresh and that kind of thing, like, that's great for the folks that, are citizens and have, the rights of all the residents of the US, but we don't have that. And it's such an obvious thing for folks who are, entrenched in that and exposed to that, but that's just one piece. And so that completely changed or completely set the trajectory for how we approach that program. So I think that's a major advantage. I don't think organizations can be good and leadership teams can't be good, and services can't be their best. Like, we just can't be our best without these perspectives in the space.
What I personally got out of that was, I think having folks with different identities, especially marginalized identities, help programs and help everything be more holistic and to be more mindful of exactly what affects other people. I like that a lot. Jenna, did you have anything to add?
So I honestly totally agree with Debbie. And when Debbie was giving her answer, I was like, oh my gosh, that's what I was going to say. So I've been thinking of something else. And actually, something very surprising that I thought of was personally for me, when you're in a minority salient identity, finding a community is really important for you, for safety and for your health in general. And because I've learned how to find and kind of entrench myself into a community wherever I go, I found that a lot of the tools that I've used to connect with people in my own community wherever I move is actually great for networking in Washington, D.C. So a very surprising kind of like tie in, but a lot of people come to me and they're like, wow, like, you're so great at like talking to people and you know what to say or you know how to break the ice. And it's like, well, yeah, because every time I move to a new city or I go to a new school or I'm in a new friend group, I have to find the people that I feel safest with, kind of not instantaneously, but you have to make that connection soon, in order to, maintain your health. So it's really bolstered my networking abilities here in DC. It's kind of just like a funky kind of asset.
No, I like it. And that's actually a perfect shifting gear, because I do want to talk about networking. So as additional context, as Jenna said, from the years that I've known her, she's great at connecting with folks and making connections. And part of the reason that she got her job in this office was due to her networking skills. And for Debbie, students have trusted her and went to her to talk about what they're feeling, thinking, and Debbie has been a supportive force in student services. So with those contexts in mind, when students holding marginalized identities come to you, Debbie, and Jenna, yourself holding some, how do you navigate networking? Because I feel like, from my point of view, as an East Asian, immigrant gay man, networking seems like a rich white cisgender man's game, right? There are rules of behavior, there are expectations on what to say, how to say something, when to say something, what to do. So, in your personal experience or in what students have told you, how do students navigate that, the networking sphere? It's not an easy question.
I don't mind. Do you mind if I go?
Go for it.
Debbie?
Yeah.
Okay. I've actually discovered through a lot of discussion and personal experience that what we think of as like the elite white male cisgender way of networking is literally the worst way to meet people ever. And so it's really funny because a lot of people are like, oh, this is like what you should do to be successful. And it's like, but have you spoken to anybody who talks to you like that? Because it's actually the most annoying kind of like way to market yourself to other people. And so personally for me, the way that I see networking is something that I developed over in college with one of my friends, Saul, who worked with the Rata Resource Centro in UC San Diego to kind of develop networking to be more accessible to people who were not white. And we basically came up with this idea that networking is just meeting new people. You're just trying to establish a connection. It doesn't have to be like a friendship, but the whole point of networking is that you're trying to find people to build your job, essentially like your ideal dream team for the workforce. And you're not going to want to work with somebody who doesn't have similar interests as you or who doesn't at least connect with you in some way. So for me, when I network, when I have coffees with people, I always like to ask, more of the questions to get to know them as a person, like what kind of music do you like, what's your all-time favorite book, like where did you grow up, like what do you do for fun, kind of things like that. Because if there's something that you can relate yourself to in any way, especially as an intern, because you have such a small period of time, if you can really ingrain yourself in their mind, not as the intern from blah, blah, blah's office or this intern that's doing such and such, but more of, oh, that's Jenna, and she and I have the same favorite book, and she and I had coffee when she was an intern here, so that when you reach out, they have that thing in their mind that kind of connects you to something about themselves, because people love to think about themselves and talk about themselves. And as much as people like to talk about their accomplishments, I have learned that people like to talk way more about the stuff that they're into and are interested in.
That is a great tip. And sort of relating it back to our students and our internships. So right now, our UCDC students are all doing remote internships. And I feel like a lot of ways to, strike up a conversation, get coffee, is through hallway conversations or walking by somebody as they're doing something. Do you have any tips, Jenna, on how students can kind of practice this interpersonal networking via, remote internship?
So a majority of the networking that I did, because the hill is so large, especially as an intern, is I actually just cold emailed people. Like even when I was in DC in person, I would like find lists of people, or like go to a networking event or have a friend go to a networking event and then have like these people that they spoke to, and they're like, oh, like this might be somebody that you're really interested to talk to, and you just cold email them or go on LinkedIn and message them. Or Washington, D.C., as I like to say over and over again, is the only city in the United States where you can email somebody you've never met and say, hi, I would like to call you sometime and discuss your job, or like, this is who I am, this is where I intern for, and I'd love to reach out and kind of get a virtual coffee. A lot of people have said like, oh, let's get virtual coffee. I'm like, oh, that's so cute. I love that. But it's the only city in the world where nobody is like, oh, I don't know this person. This is a stranger. It's like, oh, of course. This is just what we do.
Yeah, no, I love that you mentioned it. And Jen, I think our times in DC, I think Debbie, you've definitely been in DC longer. So has that been your experience too, where DC people love to talk about themselves? And going to you for your answer, do you have any tips for networking for our students?
I think most people like to talk about themselves no matter where they are. But I also think that everybody secretly wants to be a teacher or a mentor. I think people really want, it's flattering to have somebody who's interested in what you do, and wants to kind of learn about you. So to echo what Jenna said, I think the things that I heard when Jenna was talking were a focus on connection, um, and a focus on learning, honestly. And I would also add a focus on gifts. If you approach your networking, because networking essentially is the establishment of a relationship, and every relationship is going to be different. Like some will just be, you're the person that I see once a year at whatever event that we, like the Unity Breakfast on MLK Day, like that's the person, like you're the person I see there. And then there will be somewhere it's, we're talking on a daily or weekly basis, and there's gonna be a lot of in between. But I think if you can approach your networking as relationship building and really making your focus to connect with people and to learn from people and to go into it, and I know this is a part that can be really challenging, especially for folks that hold marginalized identities, to go into it with the idea that you have a gift and something to offer to that relationship as well, right? So but you may not know what that is yet. You may not know what that gift is or what that thing is that you have to offer, but one day it will come and it'll be very, very clear to you what that is, and somebody will seek you out for that thing. And so if you go into it with this idea of trying to get something, you're going to get absolutely nothing out of it, and people are going to see that right away, and they are not going to want to connect with you. It's going to feel like you're trying to, sell them a car or something that they don't need. And so I would say, yeah, the connection, the relationship, the learning, and the gift, like those are the things that I think that you should approach it with. And I guess I'll stop there because I cannot remember. I think there's a second half to your question, but I do not remember it. But those are the big pieces.
You just said, I can't remember either the second question or whatever it's so funny because the answer you already gave had me so, not stumped, but so thoughtful that I had to look at my notes to like remember the next question that I wanted to ask. I really appreciate both of you sharing on the networking front. I will say, so personally, one-on-one, I talked with Debbie and Jenna about networking in private spaces, and the tips that they gave me helped me too as, a starting out young professional out of undergrad. So I really hope that whoever's tuning in can realize that whatever identities you hold, you're valid and you deserve to make relationships. Mm-hmm. And it may be difficult to really internalize it for now, but externally, I am telling you so that you can hear it. You have value. You have so much value, and building relationships will be hard at first, but it'll be worth it. So I'm really excited for all our students.
I will also say, if I can just, if you hold an identity that is a salient identity for you that is that sometimes makes it challenging to move through this world, you have to have, in your network, you have to have other people that hold those identities. That is extremely helpful. You cannot look at a space and say, oh, that space is filled with people who mostly identify in this way, so I need to connect with people who identify in that way so that I can be in that space. Yes, on some level that is true. And it will also eat away at your soul if that is the only thing that you do. And so you need, when you're in that space, you will inevitably get targeted or triggered or microaggressed or whatever. You need to have a retreat to come back to be like, oh my gosh, can you believe what happened? You definitely don't want to do that, in a public restroom on the hill, like, because you never know who's in the stalls. But, have that person that you can, maybe send a text to or have a phone call with about kind of what's going on, because they can help refortify you and help get you back into that space where you need to be so that you can climb those ranks, so that you can be in leadership, so that you can change the trajectory, so that people who come behind you don't have to experience the same thing that you have experienced.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And the bathroom stall thing is kind of an inside joke among UCDC folks. Okay, if I can just give a quick context. One of our UCDC interns a few years ago unfortunately lost their internship because they were talking negatively about their supervisor on the Hill in a restroom stall. And somebody in the restroom who knew that supervisor told the supervisor. So it's a
Someone
lesson
who,
in
yeah, someone who is
discussion.
in that supervisor's network.
Right, right. So
Like that's,
be
and
careful.
we don't even know, I mean, you don't even know how close that is. And those things are so, I don't think you understand. I mean, maybe you do, but it's just so powerful. I will say I have had, I think, 10 jobs in my career in student affairs.
Mm,
8 of those jobs came from my network.
Yeah.
And at least half, maybe even all 8 of those, I didn't seek out the job. I was told about the job and said, hey, you need to apply. You need to apply for this thing. So if for no other reason, there's one. But it does definitely help you in ways that are just unforeseeable at this, at this juncture.
absolutely. And thank you for sharing about the 8 jobs and networks. And I think when students hear that, that's such a tangible example of the benefits of networking. And I am going to ask questions about how both of you take up space in your workplace and what that looks like, physical space and mental taking up space. I did want to time check. We have 9 minutes left. The chat window is not visible to me. So Shay, can you quickly let me know if we have any questions from students so far?
No questions so far, but if anyone has a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat.
Yes, I mean, questions, suggestions, comments, Young Chan, what happened to your arm? Like any question, just ask us, and we'll address it. But in terms of taking up space, Debbie and Jenna, I think there are 2 kinds of taking up space. The way that I can process that information, which is you physically show up in how you present yourself. And Jenna, I think we talked about it privately about how you present with your salient identity, and for Debbie as well. And also we have the mental taking up space, when we are in a room feeling like we can speak up, how we speak up and things like that. So what are your experiences in that taking up space? Jenna, would you like to share first?
Okay. For the physical taking up space, this is a story that I've told at a few of these, and it definitely is something that Young Chan is familiar with. But being in a space as a salient identity is already radical to begin with when you physically take up the space, and then making movements to kind of like be more confident in your space is just further radicalizing that kind of action. And so that can be a little uncomfortable. When I just started my first job on the Hill, I went to Young Chan and I told him that, my presentation is very important to me, and I wasn't actively presenting myself at work the way that I wanted to, and I wanted to wear ties, but I was also very conscious of how even that action is a more radical step in me taking up space, and in some ways could target me. I mean, I work in the Senate, there's a lot of bipartisanship. I have interacted with both Democrats and Republicans. I've spoken to members who have made speeches about how my own identity isn't valid. And so kind of being in that space and kind of making myself more obvious of my salient identity, especially one as a queer identity, that was something that was really weighing me down. And one thing that's just amazing and really tying into what Debbie was saying about how you need to have people in your community, in your network. The fact that I was able to talk to Young Chan about it, and for us to both discuss presentation with the queer community in professional spaces, and kind of weighing the pros and cons both as queer people was just really helpful. He was the emotional support that I needed, and even the people that are majority identities in my office were very supportive and were very helpful on that. But that is definitely something that I would kind of implore on is I need the people in my community to help me feel confident in taking up space, because it's scary to make a radical step like that.
Yeah, and I think again, Debbie had that excellent point about having your own group, and then Jenna just talked about it. But to even go on Jenna's story more, I think an example of how your in community is so important is Jenna said it's radical, to wear a tie as a cisgender woman on the Hill, and I think some people who are not in the queer community would see that and go, "Oh, it's just a tie, it doesn't matter, don't worry about it." Right? But
Yeah.
then in our queer community, we know how important gender presentation is to us. So that's why the in-group community is so important to have, as exactly what Debbie said.
Yeah, a terrible side note, but during the pandemic, my hair grew too long. And as soon as hair salons opened up, I called Young Chan and cried for 2 hours because I was like, oh my God, I need to get a haircut, but I feel like a terrible person. But that's also just like another example of how, like, for queer people, presentation is so important. I brought all of my gear. I like when I got my haircut, I felt super terrible about it, but it was very important to me. So sorry, just a side note.
No, yeah, presentation. I mean, attire-wise, and for me, like I sometimes present. Like my behavior is very feminine one day and very masculine the other. So it's just, you know, it matters a lot to us in
Yeah.
ways that make sense to us. And Debbie, in terms of taking up space, did you have anything to add?
My short thing would be to do it. Be thoughtful about how you do it, but definitely do it. And I think that's where that, again, network comes in. One thing that I'll say, because I knew we ran out of time, there are lots of great resources online for this idea of kind of building your personal board of trustees. And these are basically like a group of folks that you can go to that are kind of like your core network, right? And so it's useful to have those types of people around because, as Jenna was talking about, her presentation, yes, it's great to talk to Young Chan who identifies. It would also be great to talk to somebody who, has a really good understanding of the kind of environments that she's in, the people that she's working with. They don't necessarily have to be part of that space, but to have that perspective from here's how folks who may not understand may receive you. And not for the purpose of Jenna not to go into the space in the way that she wants to go into that space, but for her to go into that space fully informed and that she's making that decision about this is how I'm choosing to show up. And I know that this is what may be coming for me, but I know that I can be better prepared for that. And so, I think it's just kind of like feedback to your supervisor, right? Like time, place, and approach. Like you can always do it, and you can always show up. There just may be times when you choose to show up in one way or another, and it's okay to make those choices. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're yielding to the environment around you. It could be that you're protecting yourself. Like in some spaces, it's about your own personal safety. And if that's what you have to do to protect yourself, then do that. And let's figure out other ways to kind of fight those systems so that we don't have to continue to do that.
Absolutely. And I wanted to have like 30-second closing off for myself, but one sentence answer from Debbie and Jenna. With all that we talked about, students are going to go back to their internship for the rest of their work day after this. So what can they do or think and keep in mind for the rest of their internship today and have like one takeaway from today's 1 hour discussion? One sentence answer. A lot of pressure, I know.
Yeah. I want to give a challenge. I want to give a challenge for folks. So make a list of people that you would like to connect to, things you would like to learn, and gifts you feel like you can share with the world.
Thank you. And Jenna?
Connecting with your supervisor that you have right now is very important because you want to add them to your network for when you graduate, and B, you want to feel safe to advocate for yourself.
Great tip.
Good.
So I want to thank both our panelists. Debbie and Jenna's information are up there. Their emails are included because they are okay with you reaching out to them. Really quickly, I do want to acknowledge that the fires are going on in California with where you are. And PG&E, there might be power shutoffs. So if you realize that there will be power shutoffs in the next 2 weeks, let your supervisor know, work with them. Um, if there are any class or internship accommodations that need to be made, again, feel free to reach out to UCDC Academics or your AIT program administrator, and they will help you out in whatever way they can. I want to thank Debbie and Jenna again, and we will stop recording now. Thank you all for coming.